Picking up where we were this morning, we're talking where is God when things don't go well, when life kind of shatters around us. And I've talked about it in terms of grief, that there is a grieving process that goes with any major transition in life, not just a death of a loved one, but also other events, loss of a job or financial ruin, or when a child goes a different way than what you had hoped and dreamed for all of their lives, and they are in sometimes even a destructive way of living. Some of that just gets taken out of our hands sometimes. And then other events that happen, car wreck we mentioned this morning, or a war, or when things just crash in around us. There's just things that happen, that life is not always as predictable and secure as we try to make it to be. And as people of faith, we often have the same response as anybody else. We try to regroup and figure out how to get some balance in that, but we also have some resources that perhaps will help us get through it. So when I'm talking about grief, and the outline that you've been given talks about the unique journey of grief, just plug in wherever you might be, or where you know people are to be, going through a divorce or going through some other major event, and there's a grief that goes with that that's very similar. People that write a lot, and there's a little book that, if you're not familiar with it, by Granger Westberg, called Good Grief. And it's a very short read, and it was actually printed originally in the 60s. It's still in print, and it's one of the best little small outline books of what to expect when you're going through the grieving process. I recommend that to you if you've never read it. Between that and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and many other people that have written on what's the normal things that go on when people are grieving over something significant, there's some major things that happen and some things that could be expected. For example, usually the first thing when a major event happens to us is the reaction of shock. What happens when we're in shock?
We freak out.
Freak out, yeah. Well put. That's a scientific way to say it, yes. No, that's very, very descriptive. I like that. Numbness, yeah. Kind of like, I can't believe this is happening. This can't be true. When we're in shock. Do you ever feel like you're kind of detached from that event, that you're looking at it and you heard what's going on and you saw it, but it doesn't absorb?
Mental paralysis.
Mental paralysis. That's another good way. You just kind of freeze and nothing's clicking. Well, I've become convinced that shock is actually a God gift that kind of gives us the buffer that we need. We cannot accept horrific news all at once. That there's almost a need to kind of pull back from it and then absorb it in pieces. So when we're in shock, we don't stay there long, but we kind of go back into the reality. Then we may go back into shock and say, this can't be, this has got to be a bad dream, and then we go back and forth. It's just one of God's ways, I think, to help us absorb things in pieces. And so it's just very helpful to realize that that's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. Denial is often a word that's used in the grieving process. Denial, kind of going along with shock, but saying, well, this couldn't be that bad, or I'm going to get through this quicker than most people think, and it's not going to hurt, not going to be any pain. And so we kind of go into a phase in which we try to convince ourselves that this really doesn't affect me as badly as I think it might. And again, it serves a purpose to help us kind of absorb in time, and nothing wrong with denial, but you just don't want to stay there forever. But it's a coping mechanism that many of us use. You can ask somebody who's just had really bad news given them, and you say, how are you doing with that? And they'll say, well, I'm doing okay. And they mean it. They mean it for that moment. However, 24 hours later, you may get a completely different answer from them, because it may hit them completely different. We're very complex beings. We process things in a very complex way, and it's not always just the same for us. And so sometimes we need that. There's talk about bargaining in the grieving process. What do you think that would involve? Trying to make a deal? Okay. That kind of thinking like, okay, God, I will do this if you will just fix this problem, And we all tend to do that sometimes, make a promise or try to negotiate with God or with the system and say, I will do this. And you're making that out of the strong emotions of the moment to try to fix something that seems unfixable. And it's a very normal response. Again, nothing wrong with that. But it's basically a way that we have to try to absorb it. And then you've got guilt. What kind of guilt would be involved in a grieving process?
You didn't tell them you loved them before they died.
Okay, unfinished business with somebody. You didn't tell them you loved them, or there were some things that were left undone that you meant to say or wish you had have said. Kind of regret looking back on that.
Survivor's guilt.
Survivor's guilt, meaning what?
That seems to affect people a lot in the war when they live and all the people around them died.
Okay, exactly.
Or in a car wreck when you're the
Yeah.
only one that lived.
Yeah. In a war situation or somebody else. But it can actually happen with any significant loss when you think, why them? Why did they die and not me? Siblings often go through this if they lose a sibling. Parents that outlive their children often think this, even adult children. They'll say, why me? I know Carol's parents both have asked that question. They're in their 80s and the dad has since died, but his question was, why wasn't it me instead of my daughter? That's just a response that we have.
Sense of failure. If only I had.
There you go. The looking back and say, if only I had gotten them to the doctor quicker. If only I had listened to them more and tried to do things differently. Yeah, you're kind of second guessing yourself and your reaction. There's a lot of guilt involved with that. Looking, for a way to blame somebody, which gets us to the anger side. There is an anger that goes with death, any kind of death. Who would the anger be with? Many times it's God. We do question God and say, why this? Why now? Why is this system set up where people have to die? Those are normal questions for faithful Christians. And you got a lot of Scripture to back that up. We don't preach on those a lot, but go read some of the Psalms when David is saying, how long, O Lord, how long? I mean, you made this promise and you don't seem to be coming through. That's my paraphrase, but it's there. Go read Psalm 88. It has very little hope in that particular psalm. Most of the psalms, even the lament psalms, end with a word of hope. That one does not. So people of a very close relationship with God also have the right to question God. We need to hear that sometimes. If you're a parent, you understand that there's times your kids get angry with you. Right? You're not always real popular with your kids. When your child gets angry with you, do you stop being their parent? No. Not at all. And when I became a parent, I began to understand that's part of that relationship, isn't it? When things don't go like the child wants them, just like I used to be really furious with my parents. Until I became a parent, then I had a whole different set of way of looking at them. They got a whole lot smarter after I became a parent. Yeah.
Moses did that, so did Abraham. Both of them questioned God on a number of occasions.
They did. They questioned Him directly and said, what are you thinking, God? I mean, you can't do this. Yes. Moses even challenged God and brought back his own promise to him and said, no, wait a minute. If you destroy them, don't you remember when you said this? So, yeah. So you got a lot of precedent for that. We don't preach or hear that very often, that you can wrestle with God. When did the term wrestling with God show up in the Bible? Do you know? Jacob. And what was Jacob's name changed to at that moment, after the wrestling? Israel. And if you look in your Bible, many Bibles will have a footnote under that name, Israel. And what does it mean? The one who wrestles with God. And it dawned on me one day, this is the name of God's people. The one who wrestles with God. I thought, maybe He's trying to tell us something here, that it's not just that we absorb everything all at once. He expects us to wrestle with the hard things in life and to struggle and even to question why. So to put that in as part of when somebody is in a grieving process and you try to talk them out of their guilt or their anger, remember, maybe they need that. Maybe that's the way they're made at that moment, and to give them permission to do that, knowing that they are not going to stay there forever. That is part of trying to absorb it. And so when we give people the gift of just listening to that and going with that, many times they, with God's help, will work through it themselves. You don't have to take it away. There's a book title that came out a long time ago. It says, "Please don't take my grief away." And that's what we often try to do with people, right? Try to rob them of their grief in the process they're going through. If it's hard times, they need time to grieve in order to absorb it. Well, there's depression that often goes with the grieving process. Sadness. It's where you begin to turn inward and say, this hurts. I don't want to reinvest in anybody else because it hurts too much to love people. That's a response, too, to try to protect yourself from feeling this depth of pain. Panic and anxiety. What would go along with panic and anxiety if you're in the grieving process?
How will I cope? What am I going to do in the future?
How will I cope with this? What am I going to do in the future? The future seems pretty bleak at this point. I can't even see beyond today. Overwhelmed. There's just too much on my plate. For me, it's when I would say, I can't do this. You've given me too much, God. I mean, when tasks would come my way, particularly in the first few weeks after grief, and I was told, well, now you've got to work on probating the will, and you've got to settle these things with the insurance company and the hospitals. And oh, by the way, you've got to change everything that's in your double name into one name. And oh, by the way, I would just say sometimes, I just can't do this. I cannot do this. And that's a form of just being overwhelmed. You can't do it. And in fact, you cannot function when you're in grief in the same way that you can when your mind is pretty clear. It shuts down the process of being able to think through. And you kind of have to hone in and do the things that you can for that day and get to the rest later. But panic and anxiety is not a good place to be, but it's also part of trying to deal with what's called the new reality. Trying to accept the fact things have changed and they've changed permanently, even though I didn't ask for this. To resist returning to life is one thing. What would be involved with that? When somebody says, resist returning to life, how does that get said?
You become a hermit. You don't get out. You don't interact. You stop doing things that you did before that grieving. Exactly.
You stop doing the things that you were doing beforehand. You stop going out as much. You stop interacting with people. And turning inward is also a normal response. And there's even guilt involved, and this sounds funny, but once you begin to think in terms of being out with people, once you begin to think, I'm having a good time, then sometimes you begin to feel guilty that you're feeling good because I'm supposed to be grieving. And you feel like you're betraying the memory of the one that you've left behind. Now, that sounds like convoluted thinking, and that's because it is convoluted thinking, but it's exactly what many of us go through, that I'm not supposed to ever think of having a good time again, that's betraying somebody else. So again, part of the process of absorbing a bad news is that kind of stuff.
You feel like you're cheating them.
Yeah, that's right. It's almost a feeling that you're cheating them, and in fact you are not. I finally had to come to terms with the fact that Carol wants me to re-engage life. And if I refuse to re-engage life and refuse to be with people and refuse to have meaning and a good time in my life, that when I get to heaven, she's going to have an eternity of chewing me out, of saying, why are you blaming me for you not having a good time? You know, I know her well, as I can hear her now, so I'm trying to keep that in mind. I don't... yes?
John Clayton had an interesting article a couple of months ago about losing his wife and meeting his second wife.
Say a little more about that. The article about John Clayton, he says.
He couldn't imagine himself having a second wife and loving her like he did his first wife or something like that.
Yeah.
And this woman convinced him, would your first wife want you to feel this way? And that opened his mind up, and so he developed a friendship and married another lady, fine lady.
Yeah, we just don't think in those terms when we're doing that. And if it's a solid, good marriage and a mutuality, you just don't think in terms of having somebody else to, quote, replace them. And in fact, that lady did not replace the first wife. That's the thinking that's really strange, that gets us bound. We think we're replacing. It's like asking somebody who's lost a child, do you have other children? Well, what does that have to do with anything? Nobody is ever going to replace the child that was lost, right? And the same is true with a spouse. It's like asking me when my mother died, do you have a stepmother? You know, it's like, what? You know, you don't just replace somebody. We have to think differently. But it takes a while to grab onto that, doesn't it? Our world gets shattered with bad news. And we're trying to figure out again who we are, how we're going to manage through all this. Where is God in all of this? And how do we get help going through it? We re-enter life slowly. This is a process. When it's called grief work, it's well named because it's a lot of work to go through grief. I don't care what the source is. It's a lot of work to go through grief. And if you think you're going to snap your fingers and pray your way through it and be over it by tomorrow, you're in the wrong class because I'm here to tell you it's not that way. It goes on and on and on depending on how significant the loss is. It gets better, but you don't get through it quickly. So that's where we are. Eventually we get to the point, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross used the term acceptance as kind of the final stage of grief. I've never liked that. I've never accepted her term acceptance because to me that sounds passive. And I've read what she says and I know what she means. I prefer the word reconcile, that somehow you reconcile yourself to this loss and you find ways to reinvent yourself slowly and that you're bringing that part of your life with you into the new part. To me that makes a lot more sense, that you've reconciled it, but you're not necessarily turning your back on the other. You're just bringing that in with you. And the fallacy sometimes we think is, well, okay, once we do that, the pain will never be there again. I'll never feel this deeply again, this sorrow again, and I'm just going to move on. And that doesn't happen either. About 2 weeks ago, I went through the lobby of a Methodist hospital in Houston for a chaplain's meeting they were having there. And that's where Carol had been 5 times the last 2 years of her life at different times. And usually when she was there, she was pretty sick. Because a lot of stuff we did at home, and we were managing a lot of the things at home, and she did okay. But if she had to go to the hospital, it was not good. And I walked into that lobby and went by the admitting office, and I had this instant flood of feeling. It's like it was all back. I could almost see her there with me trying to negotiate the admitting process in order to get her in so that she could be a patient there. It was just like it was yesterday when I was walking through there. And those things just happen. Those things, I mean, it can be a song, it can be a smell, a particular food, somebody just saying something. There's all these things that go on inside of us that can trigger all these other memories that just come right to the surface that we think are not there anymore, but they are. And, that's okay. That also signifies the depth of love that I think you have for that person. But it's also surprising when it happens. And if you've had that happen, you know what I'm describing, that it just comes out of the blue sometimes. You don't plan those things. Let's talk for a little bit about this outline, the unique journey of grief. And I just kind of came up with things that I feel like sometimes we don't do the best in just acknowledging. And again, if you use the word death to mean disappointment, crisis, whatever situation, then that will apply here. Shattered expectations when life doesn't go the way we hoped or planned, or when something breaks through that's really disconcerting, or when we say something like, I never thought this would happen to me. That's what I'm talking about in this particular article. And by the way, that's one of the statements a lot of us make. I never thought this would happen to me, or why does this have to happen now? I remember talking to a lady who had been a patient at MD Anderson Cancer Center for a couple of years, and off and on, and she lived in a far part of the state, and so she'd had to come several hundred miles down there for treatment. And she'd done pretty well for a while, but then all of a sudden she had this visit with the oncologist, who then, after she finished that visit, she actually came down to an office I had in the chaplain's office and sat down with me and just kind of started telling her story a little bit. I've been tracking her and following her and had become very close friends with her. And I remember, her name was Joy, I remember her sitting in my office saying to me, I thought I was ready to die until I figured out the doctor was talking about me. By that, though she'd had cancer for 2 years and had been told it may or may not go well, once she heard the news that she was terminal, there's nothing else we can do, it took on a whole different meaning for her that even surprised her. Well, that's understandable, isn't it? It changes a whole lot when it becomes very personal. So we all tend to think this will not happen to me, or this will happen to me way down the road. And sometimes it doesn't work that way. No one likes to talk about death, even crisis, and yet everyone needs to. How well do you think the church does in talking about these particular topics? Not so good, right? Sometimes we dip into it, but chaplains dip into it a whole lot more than generally the local church body does. Unless something happens that creates the need for that. We just don't talk about it a lot. We don't talk about what happens when the bottom drops out of your world. What happens when you get news that your adult kids are divorcing and you didn't even see that one coming. Or when, your parents go through something that you hadn't planned on them going through, or whatever. We just don't talk about that a whole lot, and yet Scripture seems to have a lot to say about it. A lot about it. So, and it's not that we become morose and just sit around and be sorrowful and sad all the time. It means we just acknowledge the reality of it and say this is part of who we are and it's part of our journey, rather than to deny that it's going to happen to us, that we're immune from it. Tears and laughter, sorrow and joy, God's reminders of the richness of love. These, again, are the things, when somebody tears up and they're talking to you, do you try to talk them out of it? Or do you let them tear up? It's easy to laugh with somebody when they're happy and upbeat. Though that scripture that says, rejoice with those that rejoice and weep with those that weep, I've often wondered, which one of those is harder? Because sometimes it's hard to rejoice with somebody that's rejoicing, right? If they get something that you wanted, and that's what I wanted. Well, I don't know if I'm going to rejoice. Think about that one. To weep with somebody that weeps, it's also sometimes difficult to do, just to let that happen. And yet, there's a statement that says, we often forget who we laugh with, but you never forget who you share a tear with. I think there's a lot of truth to that, because there's a bond there that if somebody will let you just be who you are and to cry, it's a real gift.
Do something called sit shiva, and just sit. And I don't know, as a culture, we could do that because we want to fix it quickly.
Yeah, he's talking about the Jewish custom of sitting shiva, which is where their whole job is just to sit and to be with him. And your job, if you are a mourner or a griever, is to just sit. It's not your job to be hospitable, to jump up and welcome people into your house. It's not your job to get up and fix something. It's your job to sit and mourn and to grieve. That's your job, because everybody else is there to support you. What a concept. Right. Yeah.
But women are better, I think, at being weeping with those who weep.
I hate to admit it, but I think you're right.
It's really hard to share grief with my husband.
Yeah.
But it's really easy to share grief with my girlfriends.
Okay, there is some difference sometimes, and I think this may even be cultural as well, or it's influenced a lot by culture, that women are allowed to share more quickly on the emotional and the weeping side. Some of us men were taught very early on, don't cry.
Yeah,
big boys don't cry. There was even a song about that one.
Empathetic by nature and given exposure to the environment, become very good empathizers.
Mm-hmm. The empathy gene is certainly there, and again, culture encourages that. It's okay to be nurturing. It's part of the woman's instinct. But you know what? We're not that different. We're not that different.
It depends on how much the man is exposed to death and different circumstances of death.
Yeah,
that are in the wars. And
yes.
Often the bearers of the news of death are much more empathetic with the population as a whole.
Men that have suffered trauma personally tend to have a lot more empathy and can be responsive. I don't think the wiring's that different in us. I do think a lot of it is how we were taught. If it was modeled for you and your family that the men are to be tough and strong, then boys tend to absorb that. We just do. Nobody sits down and says this is how you are. You just see how they're supposed to respond.
I think there's also a generational difference. When I was growing up, families gathered at cemeteries. There was dinner on the grounds. You didn't have a macabre feeling about it. It was like you came and you shared a meal and you shared memories.
Right.
And you had, I mean, it was considered disgraceful not to have your relative or friend's tomb decorated for a particular holiday or have it well cared for. And we're a much more mobile society today. And the younger ones, I think, have more dread of death and more feelings that, ooh, I don't want to talk about that or even think about it than our generation.
There is a big difference, particularly in agricultural society, it was more expected that people, when a funeral and a death was an event, and you were expected to be a part of it, and it wasn't unusual for that to go on for hours and sometimes days, not just the funeral, but the whole thing, the meals together and just telling the stories and sometimes sitting up with the body. They used to keep the body in the house, right? Somebody would sit up with it all the time. Now then, with the funeral home industry, and by the way, that term was chosen on purpose, funeral home, that was chosen in order to replace what was being done generations ago. And it's not all bad. The funeral home industry is not all bad. They do provide a service, but they do distance us. I mean, we don't prepare the body ourselves, do we? We don't build the casket ourselves in most cases. We don't dig the grave. We would look at life a whole lot differently if we, in death, had to bury our own loved ones and put the dirt, actually dig the grave and actually put it on top. There are some subcultures in the U.S. that still do that, but it's the exception. That's all done for you.
But we've even stepped farther back. Our younger generations are not even exposed to the illnesses. They don't want to darken the doors of the hospitals or the nursing homes. They don't want to be exposed to the mortality of their family members, let alone theirs.
Yeah, that many young people are isolated from it, and then and again, the church could be speaking to this. You know,
we
could.
In our generation, we went to the nursing homes and took communion and provided the services and went to the hospitals.
And some of that still goes on, but you're right. I mean, just the fact that so many people are in nursing homes is different, for one thing. The population is much higher that's there. And the other is more people die in hospitals than they die in their own homes, unless you're under home hospice care or something happens that's not planned for. So even the dying process is removed often from the family. And if you're in intensive care or someplace like that, you're often isolated from being with your loved one on a regular basis. So there's a difference, and that's where the church, again, can step up and sensitize and remind us all, this is all of us. Nobody gets out alive. So sorry about that, but that's the system. I didn't set the system up. So.
We've started taking the grandchildren to the nursing home on Sundays when I think it's once a month.
Good.
It's been very interesting. It's been interesting to watch them react to the people that are there and to watch how excited the people that are there get to see the young ones.
Yeah. It is cross-generational, and both generations need it, don't they? I've seen the same thing. They light up.
Yeah, I told them when they put me there, they better come visit me too.
Yeah. Well, good. Get that in writing so that you can hold them to it. So. Dealing with grief can bring out the worst and the best in families. You know, I used to have this fantasy that, death and hard things always brought out the best in families. Not always. If there's really some hard things going on with some unfinished business between family members or just some splits, people that haven't talked together in years, and all of a sudden they're forced to be together because of this crisis, it can bring out lots of toxic feelings. And I'm talking about adult children and all kinds of things. And now with so much within our culture where there's blended families, you bring in one family and you've blended them with another family, you've got that whole layer of things to deal with too. Who's responsible for the care? Who gets to make the medical decisions? Who gets to divide the things up afterwards? That's what brings out the really best in people. We claim that it doesn't matter, nothing matters to me except the person until they die, and then we want all their stuff for some reason.
That's really bothered me over the years. I was very close to my mother, and she lived to be 91. She was widowed at the age of 44, and I was an only child. And as she got older, her relatives, her nieces and nephews, pretty much ignored her. I mean, they didn't come around. They knew she was lonely. They knew she gradually was going downhill, and they did not come around And we had some relatives on the other side of my husband's side of the family. They had visited us in 12 years. We'd see them once a year at their place. But when my mother passed away, all these people came around. And it really irritated me because I thought, she doesn't need them now. She needed them when she was living and lonely and bored and couldn't go anywhere. That's when she really needed them. And it kind of made me a little angry that, and all of a sudden, here comes everybody, and my children were teenagers, and they were telling their friends, well, people are coming out of the woodwork. Yeah. And another girl that had lost her grandparents said, they did that at my house, too. People we hadn't heard from for ages. Yeah. And it's just like they feel a need to come around when somebody's gone, but until they're gone, they don't care about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the time to bring the flowers really is while they're alive. It's while we're all alive. That's not just them. We all can get guilty of that, can we not? Avoiding intimate relationships with each other and think, well, I'll get to that later. And there's nothing wrong with all of them showing up at the funeral, but what you say is also true. The lost opportunity to be with her while she was alive, once it's gone, once that opportunity is gone, it's gone. And so that, again, people of faith, we ought to be sensitizing to each other. Life is short. It goes quickly, and there's nothing you can do about yesterday, but there's a lot you can do about today. That's all we've got is today. I don't have tomorrow. I keep finding tomorrow never comes. I went to a restaurant once, and it had a sign on the wall that said, free food tomorrow. And if I'd have gone back the next day, guess what? The sign would have still said, free food tomorrow. So if you think you're going to do it tomorrow, you might want to rethink your time frame and come back to today. So it's a very good point. So the brutal reality of death is salved by shared stories of earlier days. Talked about that a little bit this morning. We need to tell the stories. Even if they're painful stories. They don't all have to be happy stories. The painful stuff is also important. And what I find is the stories often get told more than once. I found myself telling the same story to people 2, 3, or 4 times. And I usually remember when I tell somebody something. But if you're in the middle of grief, you stop counting because you need to tell the story. You need to tell it. And so those people that hear it may hear it several times. And it was a gift when people didn't say, you've already told me that 3 times. Later I realized I'd done that, but they didn't. Yeah.
I got the rare pleasure to speak at my grandfather's funeral. Both preachers that he had in his lifetime, both of them were both ill at the time. Neither one of them could speak at his funeral. So a preacher who he did not even know had to speak at his funeral. And so I wanted to speak about certain things. And that was part of my grieving process because during the time of his transition into death, I had to give my strength to my family to help them carry through. Mm-hmm. And so during that time period, I was putting this thing together, and I was going around talking to each family member, grandkids, and the daughter and the father and son, and just talking to them about different things, and to Grandma about different stories they wanted me to share. And that was part of my process, and it was more so to anything. I didn't want to cause him to growl. He would smile because it was Grandpa. Yeah. His personality, he wanted you to smile. Yeah. He enjoyed that.
Yeah, and it's good you recognize that was part of your own grieving. That was your own way to deal with it. To hear the stories is actually very helpful for all of us. And families need to be able to tell the stories. I actually prefer funeral services like that are customized to a certain extent. And you have to draw a line. It can't all be fun and games. But to be able to tell things that actually reflect the person's life, I think is very, very healing and helpful. I like funeral services that have laughter and tears. I think we need very much both. I actually take issue with those who will stand up, and I've heard this at several funerals, who stand up at the beginning of a funeral service and say there will be no tears at this service because this is a time of great celebration. And I'm thinking, where do we get off putting those kind of boundaries up? Somebody should have told Jesus that at Lazarus' tomb. Say, what are you thinking, Jesus? Come on now. We can do both. We can cry and celebrate, can we not? So, I take issue with that, and it's one of my pet peeves is when people try to talk you out of being able to do that. That's the whole purpose of a service, is to be able to come together and share both parts.
Yeah. People forget that crying, you cry for two reasons, for grief and for joy.
Right.
And there's times when I cry. I'm a crier. I mean, I cry to drop. If something that's sad, I'll cry. If it's something that I really rejoice over, I cry like nothing else.
We can cry watching commercials.
Watching a commercial can make you cry. Well, those Clydesdale horses will get to you every time, won't they? Oh, Hallmark commercial.
I think the two times I cried the hardest was when she was baptized and her mother and dad were baptized. I cried the hardest of those two.
Sure.
That was joy.
Sure.
Just great joy, overwhelmed.
Yeah. I mean, it's part of us. Part of us, yes.
Well, I've also heard, I'm not a scientist or anything, but I have heard that there is a certain chemical that is released when you cry, and that this has a healing effect on your body. So there is that aspect to it as well, because I'm sure that God provided it if it's there.
Yeah.
And it was for our benefit.
Well, one of the studies that I've read, and it's been a while, but that there is a different makeup in tears, that there's different kinds of crying we do. It's kind of like you said, that there is a different chemical makeup in a sorrowful, wailing type of tear than there may be a tear of joy. And so I think there may be something to that. But regardless, we're made to cry as well as to rejoice. And we ought to be able to claim that. Get down to the middle one, and it says, getting over grief is impossible. Getting through grief isn't. When somebody says, are you over your grief yet? Just tell them, I'll never be over it. I may get through it, but I'm not going to get over it. That's just one preposition difference. But it's huge, isn't it? If I put on myself, I've got to get over this, that's just another layer of burden I've got to put on my grief. And in fact, we don't. We do get through it, and we do begin to re-engage life in a very different and dynamic way. But it's a long, arduous process, and it doesn't mean that I'm over. By that, I mean you don't put your grief in a nice little box, wrap it up, put it on the shelf, and say, wow, that's all over with now. That's a pipe dream. It doesn't happen that way. And if you've gone through a painful divorce, some people describe those kind of divorces as kind of like a funeral service that never ends, because you may still have to deal with the jagged edges of that, of how that person keeps showing up at various times or has to show up at various times. And any other big loss like that, there's just all kinds of things that you never quite get over, but you may be able to think in terms of getting through it. Rituals create communities and offer comfort. Avoiding rituals robs us of needed companionship. Anybody ever hear, I don't want a funeral for me? Don't cry for me? Well, you feel that way?
I do.
Okay. Then I'm going to say something to you in a loving way. It's not about you. The funeral is, yeah. And I knew you did, or I wouldn't have said it. The funeral is not about the deceased. It's about the survivors. I had a minister friend who planned out his whole service, wrote it all out. I mean, he was just kind of orderly, left brain kind of guy, and had all the songs selected, all the prayers, the scriptures, who was going to do what. Took it home to his wife, who he thought would really be glad to see this, that he'd done all this work. And he handed it to her and said, look, this is how my funeral's going to look. And she's made this very statement that I just made to her. Sorry, Bill, this isn't about you. You know, you don't get to plan everything here. So it's understandable that we could say, I don't want that for me. And yet, the reality is we've got to have some way, as a community, to mourn and grieve together. The difference in the words grief and mourning is grief is our individual response to a loss. Mourning is when we bring that together as a community. And we need times to mourn together. And a funeral or a memorial service is one way to do it. Now, there's hundreds of ways to do that, and very simple ways to do it or very complex ways to do it. There's all kinds of flexibility. But I just think we need it. There's a way to do direct burial now where you can actually, if there's no family or the family says, I want the body to go directly to the cemetery to be buried or to be cremated, they can do that and nothing's ever done. I think there's a loss there. I think at some point somebody's got to recognize this was a loss. Yeah.
It's a closure. It's not a finish of the grief, obviously, but it is
It's a marker that things are or closing. The word closure can be a very hard word too, and we often want that. It doesn't provide an end to it, but the closure in the sense of it marks that part of that person's life is over. Yeah.
Flowers or the people that are still there.
That's right.
And that is a measure of people's generosity and concern, and you can't undervalue flowers that show up after the person is dead.
Right.
To say that there should not ever be anybody doing things for the family that's alive is wrong.
No. And you're exactly right. The flowers are symbolic of that person's life and meaning to the survivors. And that's a wonderful gift. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Yeah.
In our family, my parents have put everyone to be cremated, and it's a big strife about not having, they don't want to be buried in a cemetery.
Okay.
For me, that's fine, because I see my parents every day, and I'm like, I'm going to send them flowers while they're alive. I don't understand. Should we go against their wishes and go ahead and put them in a plot so that one member of the family can visit them once a year that doesn't see them now? But she's very adamant about them having.
I refuse to get into your family dysfunction.
Is that something that we need to concede on? Is that something that she would do?
I would say.
I don't need it.
These are the kind of things that really it's better. If you're talking about it now or can talk about it now, it's much better than after the death occurs when everything gets heightened. All the feelings get really heightened and it becomes much more of a battle. Territorial, possessive battle, or you're going to do it my way. People have different needs. I think even with cremation, there can be a burial with the urn if you choose to do that and go have a place to go and see. Most cemeteries will do that too. And it's much less costly than to bury a casket.
Well, my opinion is it doesn't matter to me and it matters to you. Do it your way.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't matter to me.
Yeah.
But I didn't know if that was part of that grieving process.
Well, some of us need markers and need a place to go to. Some of us find comfort in going to the graveside and seeing that. For some people, that's not very helpful to them, and they don't do it very often just for that reason. So it's just how we're different. And I think you're on the right track when you say, do it the way that you need to do it, and I will go along with it. You don't have to necessarily agree with it.
I mean, if it doesn't matter to me,
yeah.
And it matters to you.
Yeah. Yeah, we had to compromise that on my mom's service. She didn't want a viewing, and she really didn't want a funeral. And you're not the only one. No, you're not the only one. And we first thought about as a family just having a small graveside service just for the family. And then we got to thinking, she's lived 87 years in this community of 5,000, and I said, she's fed half of them herself at different times. She was one of these always took food to everybody. And I said, there's people that want to say their goodbyes. And so the funeral service was a way to do it. And the viewing we did, not at the service, but at the night before. And actually my dad needed that because my dad was in a different town when she died, and he couldn't be with her. And so he needed to see her in his own way for the last time. And it brought great closure and the sense of comfort to him that he could actually see the body. Because he was afraid with the cremation, because she chose to be cremated, that he wouldn't even get to see the body. So for him, it changed the rules, and my mom would have agreed with that in that sense. So, all right, we've got time for one last comment. Then we'll close with the very last sentence on here. You can read the rest yourself. Being in grief is not being crazy. It just feels like it. And, boy, is that an understatement. Thanks so much.